911, what's your emergency?
I need the police. Someone is breaking into my neighbor's house.
This call was recorded in a small town in Ohio on the 15th of January 2024, in an LA neighborhood that was shattered instantly by a man who walked into his home expecting the familiar comfort of his marriage, his faith, and his life as he knew it. Instead, what he saw in that bedroom changed everything. Within seconds, rage took over. The next thing anyone knew, 5 stab wounds, a bloodied floor, and a crime that sent shock waves far beyond the walls of that house. This wasn't just any man. He was a pastor, someone people trusted, someone who preached about love, forgiveness, and morality. Gregory Adams, a respected figure in his community, a husband and a father, returned home earlier than expected on a Wednesday evening. What he walked into was something no husband ever prepares for. His wife, Sharon Adams, wasn't alone. She was in bed with the 15-year-old son of their next-door neighbor. But before we go on to uncover this terrifying story, can you go ahead to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment, because this helps us work tirelessly to provide you with stories around the world that leave you questioning every truth you have known. Gregory's world shattered in an instant. Whatever restraint he had left crumbled. Within moments, he grabbed a knife and stabbed Sharon 5 times before the teenager managed to escape and call for help. By the time authorities arrived, the scene inside was pure chaos. Blood, panic, disbelief. Gregory, still clutching the knife, stood over his wife, his expression unreadable. Sharon, though severely injured, was still alive, and the teenager, terrified, shaken, was the key witness to it all. This wasn't just another crime. It was a collision of power, trust, and the unthinkable happening in a place where people least expect it. A religious leader, a betrayal, a minor, and a moment of rage that could never be undone. It raised unsettling questions. How does someone who preaches forgiveness react to ultimate betrayal? What drives a person to snap in an instant? And beyond the crime itself, there was a legal storm brewing. Did Gregory act in the heat of passion, or was there something deeper at play? Some saw his actions as the breaking point of a man who had lost everything in a single moment. Others argued that, no matter the betrayal, violence was never the answer. But in that courtroom, only one thing mattered. What would justice decide? This case left a community divided. It left a family broken, and it left behind a haunting question. Was this a crime of passion, or a calculated response to a betrayal too great to bear? Sharon Adams was more than just the pastor's wife. At 38, she was known for her warm smile and unwavering devotion to the community. She led women's Bible studies, helped organize charity drives, and stood beside her husband every Sunday morning as he delivered sermons about faith and resilience. But behind the polished image was a woman struggling with silent battles. Friends had noticed a shift in her demeanor months before that fateful night. Once vibrant and engaged, Sharon had become distant. Some thought it was the pressure of being a pastor's wife, a role that demanded perfection at all times. Others speculated that trouble was brewing in her marriage. Then there was the shocking revelation, her relationship with a teenage boy. It was something no one could comprehend. What could drive a woman in her late 30s to risk everything for a 15-year-old? The boy in question was the son of their next-door neighbor. Michael Carter was a high school sophomore, known for his quiet nature. He came from a single-parent home, his mother often working long shifts to make ends meet. Michael and Sharon's connection had formed gradually. He had started doing small chores for her, carrying groceries, raking leaves, small tasks that allowed him to earn extra cash. Somewhere along the way, boundaries blurred. Investigators later found texts between them, messages that revealed an emotional and physical entanglement that had been building for months. Sharon had crossed a line that could never be justified, and when Gregory discovered them in bed together, the consequences were catastrophic. Gregory Adams, 42, had built his entire life around faith. Raised in a strict Christian household, he had always been seen as a man of discipline and integrity. His sermons focused on redemption and the power of forgiveness. To his congregation, he was a pillar of wisdom, the man people turned to in times of crisis. But his personal life was far more complicated than the image he presented to the world. Those close to him knew he had a temper, one that only surfaced behind closed doors. He was a man who believed in control over his household, his reputation, and most of all, his wife. For years, their marriage had been rocky. There were whispers that Gregory's dedication to the church had come at the expense of his relationship with Sharon. He was constantly working, counseling, and traveling for ministry. Sharon, left in the shadows of his ambition, had confided in friends that she felt neglected, invisible. When Gregory walked into that bedroom and saw Sharon with Michael, something inside him snapped. This wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. The woman he had vowed to love and protect had broken the sacred vows of marriage in the most unthinkable way. And worse, with a minor. He later told investigators that he had blacked out in that moment. One second he was standing in disbelief. The next there was blood on his hands. But was it truly a crime of passion, or had years of resentment been waiting for an excuse to explode? The Adams and the Carters had been neighbors for nearly 6 years. Their homes sat just a few feet apart, their lives intertwined in ways neither family could have foreseen. Sharon and Michael's relationship had started innocently, or at least that's how Sharon had justified it to herself. He was vulnerable, lonely, in need of guidance. But what began as mentorship had turned into something entirely different. Michael's mother, Dana Carter, was devastated when she learned the truth. She had trusted Sharon. She had let her son spend time in the Adams home, believing he was in safe hands. The betrayal cut deep. The church community was in shock. Gregory was their leader, the man who had baptized their children and presided over their weddings. Now he was facing charges of attempted murder. Michael was now at the center of a legal and emotional storm. His mother pulled him from school, fearing the backlash. He was interrogated by police, examined by therapists, and labeled either a victim or an accomplice, depending on who was telling the story. This case unfolded in a small Ohio town where religious values were deeply ingrained in the community. Faith wasn't just a personal belief, it was a way of life. The Adams family was well respected, and Gregory's position as a pastor placed him under even greater scrutiny. The town's reaction was divided. Some saw Gregory as a victim, a man pushed to the edge by an unimaginable betrayal. Others saw him as a violent criminal, a man who had nearly killed his wife in a fit of rage. Then there was the uncomfortable conversation about Sharon's actions. She had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a minor, something that could not be ignored. But would she face the same level of public condemnation if the roles were reversed? The legal battle that followed was messy. Gregory's defense team argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, that any husband would have reacted the same way. Prosecutors, however, saw it differently. This wasn't about passion, it was about control. Gregory had made a choice, and that choice had nearly cost Sharon her life. Meanwhile, Sharon faced her own legal troubles. Authorities had to determine whether she would be charged for her relationship with Michael. Was it statutory rape, abuse of power, or a twisted love affair? With 2 lives shattered and a community in turmoil, the courtroom became the battleground for justice. Would Gregory be convicted of attempted murder? Or would his actions be seen as justifiable in the eyes of the law? Would Sharon face criminal charges for her involvement with a minor? Or would public sympathy shield her from legal consequences? And what would become of Michael, a boy caught in the middle of a crime that would haunt him for years to come? As the trial unfolded, one thing became clear. This was more than just a story of infidelity and violence. It was a case that forced an entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about love, power, and the thin line between faith and fury. In the end, was justice served? Or did the courtroom, like the crime itself, leave more questions than answers? There were whispers, rumors that the Adams marriage was strained, that the warmth between Gregory and Sharon had started to fade. Friends noticed a shift in Sharon's demeanor. The way she'd once sat in the front pew, beaming up at her husband as he spoke, had changed. Her smile seemed forced. Her absences from church became more frequent. But no one could have guessed what was happening behind closed doors. No one could have predicted what Gregory was about to uncover. Gregory had always taken pride in his family, in his home, in his faith. Yet in the weeks leading up to that night, there had been moments, tiny, insignificant at first, that gnawed at him. The late-night phone calls Sharon took in hushed tones, the way she suddenly seemed distant, lost in thought, and then the lingering looks she exchanged with the boy next door, a teenager. It didn't make sense. He refused to believe it. But doubt is a dangerous thing. It festers, it grows, it takes root in places you don't want it to. Then came that night. Gregory had finished a midweek church meeting early and decided to surprise his wife with dinner. He picked up her favorite meal, even double-checked to make sure he got the right sides. There was a familiar comfort in knowing that, no matter what, he could always come home to her. But as he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house was too quiet. No sound of the television, no music playing, just silence. The door wasn't locked. He stepped inside, calling her name. No answer. And then he heard it. Soft laughter. The kind that doesn't belong to a married woman alone in her house. The kind that makes your blood run cold. He moved toward the bedroom, every step slow, deliberate. His heart pounded in his ears. The door was slightly ajar, and what he saw on the other side shattered him. His wife, tangled in the sheets, and a boy, barely old enough to drive, lying beside her. The moment lasted only a fraction of a second, but it felt endless. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook. He had imagined every betrayal except this one. The world blurred as he lunged forward. The teenager scrambled away, panic setting in as he saw the rage in Gregory's eyes. But it was Sharon who took the brunt of it. A kitchen knife, 5 strikes, each one a release of pain, fury, devastation. By the time he stopped, Sharon was gasping, her body trembling from the wounds. Blood seeped into the sheets, pooling onto the floor. The teenager, paralyzed by fear, found his voice long enough to scream. And then he ran. The first call to 911 came from the neighbor's house. The boy had made it across the yard, frantic, barely able to get the words out. "There's been a stabbing. My neighbor, he's a pastor, he just stabbed his wife. Please, you have to come now." Dispatchers struggled to make sense of the hysteria, but within minutes, squad cars were on the way. Back inside the house, Gregory stood over Sharon, his breathing ragged. The weight of what he had done was setting in, but he didn't move. He didn't run. The first officers on the scene found him exactly like that, motionless, still holding the weapon. One officer shouted at him to drop it. He did. Then without a word, he placed his hands behind his head and surrendered. Paramedics rushed to Sharon. Despite the severity of her wounds, she was still conscious, barely whispering as they tried to stop the bleeding. The boy, now sitting in the back of a police cruiser, was in shock. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He wasn't just the witness. He was the reason it happened. News of the crime spread before the sun even rose. The headlines were ruthless. A man of God, a leader in his community, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in an attempted murder case. Neighbors were in disbelief. "I just can't believe it," one woman told reporters. "Pastor Adams was the last person I'd expect to do something like this." Others were less sympathetic. "I mean, what did he expect? His wife was messing around with a kid. He snapped. Any man would." The debate had already begun. Was Gregory Adams a cold-blooded criminal? Or was he a broken man who had simply lost control? As the case moved into the legal system, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Because the question on everyone's mind now was, would the justice system see Gregory Adams as the villain or the victim? The teenager, the only other witness, had run outside, his panicked 911 call still echoing through the dispatch radios. His voice cracked with fear. He kept repeating the same words. "He caught us. He caught us. He went crazy. Please help." Law enforcement immediately detained Gregory. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply stood there, his eyes vacant, his body rigid. When an officer instructed him to drop the knife, he did. When they ordered him to kneel, he obeyed. It was as if his mind had already left the moment, retreating into the dark corners of whatever realization had taken over. Sharon was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The injuries were severe, deep wounds across her abdomen and chest. Paramedics worked quickly, stopping the bleeding as best they could. She faded in and out of consciousness, but she was alive. Inside the house, investigators worked swiftly. Every movement mattered. Every second counted. They had to piece together the scene before memories faded and before anyone could alter the evidence. The crime itself was straightforward, but the case? That was another story. The teenager's testimony was the first major piece of evidence. He gave a detailed account of what happened, how Gregory came home earlier than expected, how the door creaked open just as he and Sharon were in bed together. The look in Gregory's eyes, the sheer silence before the explosion of rage. He described how Gregory lunged at Sharon first, how he barely escaped, running out of the house in nothing but his boxers, dialing 911 with shaking hands. His story alone was damning, but investigators needed more. The bedroom was a crucial crime scene. Blood spatter patterns confirmed that the attack was frenzied, up close, forceful. Sharon hadn't been stabbed all at once. There were pauses, moments between each strike, as if Gregory had stopped just long enough to think before plunging the blade in again. Neighbors reported hearing shouting. A few even told police they had seen Gregory pull into the driveway earlier than usual. One woman walking her dog had noticed his car idling for a few minutes before he finally turned it off and stepped out. Had he sensed something? Had he waited outside, debating whether to enter? Then there was Gregory's interrogation. He was calm, too calm for someone who had just committed an act of brutal violence. When asked why he did it, he only gave one answer. I walked in and she was with a child. My neighbor's son. I did what any man would do. But the investigators weren't convinced. Despite how straightforward the crime seemed, complications arose almost immediately. First, there was Sharon's survival. Since she wasn't dead, this wasn't a homicide case. It was attempted murder. That changed the entire legal framework. Second, there was the question of self-defense or provocation. Gregory's defense team argued that he had experienced an uncontrollable moment of rage, a crime of passion, triggered by the ultimate betrayal. In legal terms, this meant they could argue for manslaughter instead of attempted murder with intent. But prosecutors weren't convinced. Sharon had been stabbed 5 times. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. That wasn't just an outburst of rage. That was intent. And then there was the age of the teenager. He was 15, a minor. This shifted the focus of the investigation. Was Sharon guilty of statutory rape? Had she groomed him? And if so, did that change how the law would view Gregory's actions? Suddenly, the case wasn't just about the stabbing. It was about the deeper, more disturbing layers of what had happened inside that home. Law enforcement officials later spoke about the complexity of the case. One detective, who remained anonymous, told a local news outlet, "At first we thought this was just another domestic violence case. But the more we uncovered, the more we realized. This wasn't just about a man attacking his wife. This was about betrayal, about power, about lines being crossed in ways that went far beyond one marriage." Another investigator put it even more bluntly. People wanted to make Gregory the villain, and in many ways he was. But the deeper we looked, the more we saw that Sharon wasn't innocent either. This case was a mess from every angle. As the investigation continued, the focus turned to one final question. Was justice even possible in a case where every side had something to answer for? The courtroom was silent as Gregory Adams stepped forward, his hands shackled, his face unreadable. The man who once led a congregation in prayer now stood before a judge, facing the weight of his own actions. The prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of calculated rage. This wasn't just a crime of passion, they argued. This was an act of premeditated violence. They emphasized the 5 stab wounds, the deliberate nature of the attack. If it had been just 1, maybe even 2, they said, perhaps they could believe it was an uncontrollable reaction. But 5? That showed intent. That showed a man who, even after the first strike, kept going. The defense pushed back, hard. Gregory wasn't a violent man, they insisted. He was a man of faith, a man who had given his life to guiding others. What he walked into that night, they argued, would break even the strongest of men. His entire world collapsed in an instant, and for those few moments he lost himself. They called it temporary insanity, an uncontrollable reaction fueled by deep emotional distress, a moment of madness, not a planned act of violence. And then there was Sharon. She sat in the witness stand, her voice barely above a whisper, recounting what happened that night. She didn't defend herself. She didn't deny the affair. She simply spoke of Gregory, the man he had been before that night and the man who stood before her now. When asked if she believed he meant to kill her, she hesitated. "I don't know," she finally said. And that hesitation, those few uncertain seconds, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some kept their eyes fixed on Gregory. Everyone knew the facts. But this case wasn't just about facts. It was about human nature, about emotions that defied logic. Outside the courtroom, the public had already made up their minds. The case had gone viral. News anchors dissected every detail. Social media exploded with debates. Some saw Gregory as a monster, a man who let rage consume him. Others saw him as a victim, a man pushed past his breaking point. Hashtags flooded timelines. Justice for Gregory. No excuse for violence. Opinions clashed in the comment sections of news reports, in television debates, in church sermons. Some ministers spoke in his defense, calling it a tragic moment of human weakness. Others condemned him, saying a true man of God would have walked away. And then there was the boy, the teenager who had been at the center of it all. He refused to testify in court. His parents, devastated by the scandal, moved away before the trial had even begun. As the days in court dragged on, the energy in the room shifted. The weight of the case pressed down on everyone. The closing arguments came, both sides delivering their final blows. The prosecution pointed to the evidence, the knife, the wounds, the intent. They called it an act of rage but made it clear. Rage was not an excuse for attempted murder. The defense urged the jury to see Gregory as more than just a man who lost control. They reminded them that this was a husband, a pastor, a man who had built his life on faith, until in one devastating moment, it was all ripped away. And then, after weeks of testimony, the waiting began. When the jury returned, the courtroom held its breath. Gregory stood, his eyes locked on the judge, his hands clenched in front of him. The verdict was read. Guilty, attempted murder. The weight of the words settled over the room like a dense fog. Gregory didn't react, not at first. Then slowly he nodded. Whether it was acceptance, disbelief, or something else entirely, no one could tell. Sentencing followed. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the case, the pain on all sides. But the law was the law. Gregory Adams was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Some called it justice, others called it too harsh, and then there were those who called it mercy. Sharon, still bearing the scars of that night, sat in the back of the courtroom. When asked for a comment, she simply said, "I forgive him." Whether Gregory would ever forgive himself, though, was a question only time could answer. And with that, the case was closed. But for the people involved, for the community, for the church congregation that once looked up to him, the scars of that night would never fully fade. Some wounds heal, others remain just beneath the surface, quiet, waiting, forever a reminder of the moment when everything changed. For Sharon, the wounds ran deeper than the scars on her body. She would never erase that night from her mind. The moment she saw her husband, the flash of the blade, the pain that followed. She moved away, leaving the whispers and judgment behind, but the past followed her no matter where she went. The boy, once just a teenager with no idea of the chaos he would cause, carried his own burden. His name had been dragged through the media, his reputation forever tied to that one night. He lived in the shadow of the scandal, trying to rebuild, trying to forget. For Gregory's congregation, the betrayal was twofold. First, the pastor's wife, caught in an affair with a minor. Then the man they had trusted, allowing rage to consume him in such a violent way. Some forgave, others never did. The case left people divided. Some saw Gregory as a man who had simply reacted, unable to control the fire of betrayal. Others saw him as someone who had lost his moral standing long before he reached for that knife. And then there was the legal side. The case raised questions about emotional reactions in the heat of betrayal. Could a moment of rage ever justify extreme violence? Some pushed for clearer distinctions in sentencing, when crimes were committed in states of extreme emotional distress. Others argued that punishment should never waver, no matter the circumstances. Years later, Gregory sat in his prison cell, no longer a pastor, no longer a husband, just a man left with his thoughts. Regret, anger, sorrow, they all lived within him. He had lost everything in those few seconds. And no matter how much time passed, one truth remained. That night, in that bedroom, life as he knew it had ended, and it could never be undone. This case isn't just a story, it's a reflection of how betrayal, trust, and emotional breaking points can lead to devastating consequences. What do you think? Was this an act of momentary rage, or should Gregory have handled things differently? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you found this case disturbing yet important, consider looking into documentaries on crimes of passion, domestic violence awareness, and legal defenses related to temporary insanity. Understanding these cases helps us recognize warning signs and the impact of unchecked emotions. Most importantly, if you or someone you know is struggling with emotional distress, betrayal, or violence in a relationship, please seek help. There are resources available, and no one should face these situations alone. If you want more deep dives into real cases like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching, and remember, behind every headline, there's a story that deserves to be understood.